And in concluding on our discussions of Aristotle here, I want to now introduce ethics, at least proper here. And so, to reiterate on another video where I discussed how most people start off with Aristotle with logic and sort of work out from there towards his ethical thinking and then concepts such as the metaphysics, I chose to start off with the metaphysics and talk of his teleology, because I think if you understand where he's coming from with his teleological philosophical framework, then you can see how this is going to spread out, much like his predecessor Plato, by the way, with the divided line analogy, to be another central point, really, for his philosophical framework. Looking at an ethical system with such a philosophical preference, such as teleology, then we're going to be having a consideration of function and its properties that make it up, such as, of course, when he discusses the human soul. As seen last time with his distinguishing characteristics of the different varying functions of different souls, such as the nutritive with the vegetative, and the sensitive or the sensory, the conscious or feelings of the animal soul. And then, of course, up the ladder of the hierarchy, if you will, you then have the rational soul, the rational function being what distinguishes humans from all other beings on this world. And so the good then, as follows, would be a proper functioning or a complete and whole life in accordance to reason or accordance to virtue, at least for something with the potential or the capacity of rational thought. Virtue, of course, being seen here as really the proper functioning, and we can see the parallels to the other virtues for Aristotle is, with good functioning and to have an accordance to reason is to have the inner telos, to have a say in one's final cause of what we are actualizing, our potential, a complete life. That is to be in accordance to reason. And the Greek terminology here, it would be arate, where it's a sort of broader definition than the way we understand it now. Arate is of excellence or of quality of a virtuous person or characteristics. We have the human quality to life functioning should be one of excellence. Now, for Aristotle, virtue in a whole life has both the function of the outward, the behavioral, if you will, the sort of social games, how you're perceived, and then you have the inner disposition as well, the inner attitude, the motives or the intentions. Virtues are considered moral disposition. Moral disposition is what disposes you to certain behavior patterns, the inner functions to proper external functioning in the other way. The virtuous, of course, is inward directed rather than just a stimulus response. So you consider your thinking about these things. You don't just react towards a stimulus reaction. That would be more in line with the good of the animal functioning. Whereas here you're able to think and perceive inward to know. The question then remains, if this is proper functioning, how do we actually acquire proper functions? How do we actualize this actually in our lives? How do we do this for other human beings or have a sort of repetition about it? How do we get to our own potential is to ask. Aristotle will then turn to the idea of habit and habit formation. A settled disposition, or a sturdy one, is a habit of the heart. But how do we actually achieve this, though? And so Aristotle turns then to moral development or character, such as a set of virtues put together, or vices, as you have this sort of anti-hero character today culturally, where you have in unexpected ways perhaps negative traits. Who has all of these negative vices? He cusses like a sailor. He's a drunk, but there is the speck of good within him, and sometimes he does the right thing. And so, to that capacity, we're developing these sorts of traits. And so, a complete life in accordance to reason, then, it must require habits that are rationally guided, or won't be in accordance to virtue. Deliberation and choice in different matters when one is faced with two paths, the deliberation of ends or telos, or means to those ends, and choice in accordance to those thoughts. And so doing this in once a habit doesn't form, Aristotle says, just as he talks about the sparrow does not a summer make, nor does a single day make up a year. You have to have consistency. And so deliberation again and again until the mental habit is then formed, and then repeated through for choice or action. And this is, of course, the case when learning a new skill, that eventually you develop the unconscious habit. But how do we actually achieve that? And so one must face what he calls deliberation again and again to form habits, to form a sort of consistency, if you will. You have to go through the repeated thoughts, and then you make the choice, which of course then proceeds with the action. This is also the case with physical habits. The cultivation of discipline of the mind, the ends are means to the end, and then the decision to act accordingly. Of course, right now, is with fitness content really blowing up in the last 5 to 10 years, especially I would say in the last 5 for sure, where you're trying to build physical habits by going to the gym, by eating a healthier lifestyle. And so you have to face that disposition, if you will, to make these choices, to think about these sorts of things. And so Aristotle, of course, knows that this requires self-discipline, or sort of temperance as the virtue goes. But how do you get this if you don't already have it within you? And if you require more of it in order to obtain success, then it becomes sort of circular. It's like trying to develop a giant snowball and not having enough snow really around to be able to really feel and build momentum as you ball up the snow together. For Aristotle, he would say that they suffer from akrasia, or weakness of the will. They lack resolve to make the reasoned decision and stick through with it, of course, through their actual actions. And if you're unable to be ruled by your own reasoning, such as with young children, or this is where Aristotle talks about people being natural slaves, they must be ruled then by other people's reason. And so in child development, proper habits are instilled by discipline, and Aristotle really recognizes that this entire lack of discipline, or weakness of the will, if you will, as really the sign of our human moral failing. This is to be combated. This is our flaw, if you will. And in the idea of the Plato myth of the winged horses, this is how one controls his appetites. The horses, if they are not in tandem together, if they don't do their distinguished roles, if they're not all ordered, if you will, ordered by reason, if you're not able to order your appetites, then you can't have control of over your own life, and you must adhere to reason. If not, then the chariot's going to crash, and your journey is going to be cut short, or it will be filled with suffering. And now, what is deliberation? The deliberation is a mean between extremes. Virtue is proper functioning of an aspect of the soul or personality. A given trait or characteristic might be in excess, or sort of out of balance. You might have a deficiency. And so what we seek in the quality, neither excess or lacking, we must shoot for the balance, if you will. That should be our goal, the medium, to have a full life, if you will. And so this deliberation is the seeking of that balance. And as seen with Aristotle, as how he looks at the soul, he says the vegetative life, the basic, is of nutrition and reproduction, good functioning of health or its ends. And then the animal soul, in case it's the attention of the sensitive or sensory, the particular conscious feelings or emotions. The proper use here produces the moral virtues where appetite and desire are in balance. Now, the rational soul, with its use of thoughts and speech or the arts, is really its distinction of its proper functions. This, of course, is turning to then an intellectual virtue. And so Aristotle here has an interesting distinction between what he considers practical wisdom and contemplative wisdom. The sensitive life, feelings or appetites, if you will, may be felt too much or perhaps too little, reminding us of excess and deficiency again, rather than a harmonious life, if you will, of a proper feeling at the right time to the right object, so your intentionality is guided right, you're worried about the right things, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way. And so this is the proper balancing in what we seek out when we are doing the deliberation process. It doesn't necessarily mean that, some feelings that perhaps have negative connotation to it, such as anger, if you will. We don't really culturally like the idea of anger or being angry. But at the right time, in the right object, to the right people, and going about it in the right way, then anger can facilitate the greater good, if you will. And, hunger. A lot of times we suffer for sure in a gluttonous culture, and so perhaps we are overnourished, we're given too much, if you will. But a hunger within reason, or a hunger in a full life, then obviously you need to sustain yourself. And so when you feel hungry at the right time in the right place, then and so on, then that is hunger used for the good. And so it can't just be in short, the idea of something like pleasure. That's really what he's trying to get at here, is that, not one single emotion, sorry, the sun's really beating in right now, can really, stand alone as the most virtuous, and we'll explain more on that later. And so we must monitor and guide and control our emotional lives. These are the moral virtues, the virtues of courage, for example. The excess of this courage would be foolhardiness, and that's a sort of deficiency, an excess, if you will, having too much courage and then using it in an inappropriate time, overly heroic, if you will, and you just march off into battle and you just die instantly, if you will. That might not make you, of course it's courageous, but it's also foolish. And so then you of course have the deficiency with cowardice, with being a coward, and lacking courage. And so the virtue of the generous, where the deficient state would of course be being too stingy, whereas excess would be perhaps throwing around too much generosity and giving it to the wrong people, being misused in that sort of sense. And so as you can see here, Aristotle is advocating really for a means between all of the different extremes, with a proper emotionally functioning human being, trying to find a balance. And of course, Aristotle, it's easy to see here where his predecessors would talk of reason and what is just and what is the proper ordering. You notice when many of his predecessors would talk about Euclidean geometry, there's a reason why with many of their ethical thinkings or ideas of the good, there's always ratios, a golden ratio. The proportions are perfect, which is true, of course, with how Greek culture saw ideally. Now, how does something like pleasure work into the moral life? In the Nicomachean Ethics, he insists pleasure isn't the same as happiness. Happiness, of course, is proper function and well-being. Pleasure, of course, is of the emotions or feelings and can be wrongly felt and misplaced. Pleasures are intermittent and contingent largely on externals, largely that are beyond our control. And with it, you have a plethora of various moral values to them. So pleasure then cannot be the highest moral value, as we discussed a little bit earlier, if we measure virtue to varying moral worth. We may, of course, have pleasure eating a steak or eating junk food, and you may feel good about it for an hour, just as we also may have pleasure exercising or reading Aristotle. They have a varying degree of moral worth, but they're all pleasurable in different ways. And so Aristotle's moral psychology here to say is that pleasure is not an end to be pursued, but it is just the byproduct or a side effect or actualizing other more important virtues and matters at hand. And, pleasure is just a side effect of that. That just follows through. You can spend money on a delicious meal and enjoy the pleasure if it's the consumption at the time, but the ends, if you will, later on when you get the tab and you see how much you overspent on it, that says otherwise. So this is leading us to really introduce, of course, with his political thinking, and how do we introduce government into this conversation now, and really the placement of the artisan world at large with a discussion of moral development. Now, his predecessor Plato saw both to contribute to the improvement of the soul, and so does Aristotle with regards to politics and art. In fact, political theory, of course, up until we get to Machiavelli, in the Renaissance, says that a proper government function is of the good rather than really power or sustaining it, if you will. Aristotle sees government as the human telos arrangement, really. The human being is not just rational, let's not forget, but he's also a societal being, and our nature is social. And of course, in tandem with his views on metaphysics, the philosophical telos here, we can see that ends here is to have proper function as a social being, is to be a social animal, and a well-oiled one at that. Aristotle would scoff at the idea of loneliness today, I really think, in today's world. We're not really of proper function. We don't have the same goals as Aristotle would. We're very much more in the sort of individualistic mindset, where Aristotle is very much in the category of interdependence. And really the only way to have the human good for Aristotle is to have a virtuous society by its proper societal functioning, not just with the individual. So our well-being socially is really what Aristotle's all about. It's not so much the individual achievement, but how he is functioning around in his society. And so what is the ideal state for this then? This, of course, is of proper function in the nature of the state and its proper ends. What is, of course, a just society? A just society is one that is rationalized for the common good. A just or good individual, one, of course, who is properly ordered to his good, and, of course, with the state, politics at large, it requires a proper ordering in order for it to be good. So the individual who has his life unified and put together, who makes individual choices that are for the good, then expands out and should have a state that represents that same concept. just on a larger scale. Now, of course, with his teacher Plato, he repudiated all the other existing forms of government and saw them as unsuited and unjust, such as aristocracy, democracy, tyranny, oligarchy. The one and only good ruler, if you will, is of the philosopher king. Plato's ideal, of course, the transcendent heavenly forms, is the ideal state, really. However, for Aristotle, form, of course, as we've discussed many times with his metaphysics, is only in particular. And so particulars imperfectly actualize the forms. So we might actually have a lot of imperfect governments or institutions that actualize, or at least try to, the ideal state. And so Aristotle, as opposed to his teacher, is going to be way more open to the other constitutions and alternative ordering of the state. He is not interested in an ideal structure, a transcendent heaven, if you will, but of the proper function of any society of family in sorts of matters such as education or economics. Aristotle, in his education, he advocates for a full life, and so that essentially would mean that you would want to touch base with a multitude of things to facilitate a full life, or to give an education towards it that would cover as many aspects as possible. Now, I would say, though, that our society, American society, if you will, we are much more indebted, I think, to the Platonic tradition here, where certainly with the case, of course, with the state of the American Empire, where, paradoxically, and this is an old thought on the channel, our liberal democracy, our society that, has a sort of global hegemony, in order to facilitate it, in order for it to sustain itself, it pretty much had to run every other type of government out of town in order to adhere to its own properties. And so you have a sort of paradox here where, despite the fact that we are supposedly, pluralists, when it comes to the world stage, we very much are dogmatic in that American society really is the way to go, and we won't have it any other way, really, or we won't be friendly with you, and you'll be largely shut out of the world stage. And so, that's a thought for a different day, if you will. But I would say also with ideology, certainly in the 21st century, in the late 20th century, we very much seem to come, with a sort of notion that, there is only one way, an ideal way, and it's my way, the way I think, and there shouldn't really be any alternatives. But, ultimately we somewhat accept that there is at least one alternative in the two-party system, and you can kind of see that play out with how we treat each other, if you will. And so I think we're much more, we live out a much more Platonic way of thinking, I would say, in this regard, than Aristotle, who sees it more as, well, how can we really direct ourselves toward the supreme being despite these circumstances? Yeah, there isn't a rendition, if you will, a representation of an ideal heavenly Platonic state, but there are pieces of it within all of these different societies. And I don't think that he's necessarily, and this would be a big mistake, I would say, that he's not going to be relativistic about this. We have to be careful here. He definitely much is saying, we should shoot for the supreme being. He's not, being a relativist here. And so I think it's important to point that out as well. Now, turning to his discussion of the arts, we see the initial similarity really to, again, his teacher Plato, where he talks of art as imitative. But this is really about the cutoff point here with their thinking, because art for Plato should, of course, imitate the transcendent form. So art that imitates individuals, if you will, even Socrates, which is the case, are then twice removed from reality, because Socrates, as a man, is simply a copy of the forms that embody him. Aristotle would say that art isn't imitation of form, but imitation of life. And it's translated as a representation of life through the characters and their emotions. Now, of course, Plato would warn against imitating others, especially with emotions, with how he felt about plays, especially with Aristophanes. Representing emotions and characters and their actions, that's far removed from real reality for Plato. Um, Now, with Aristotle here, he's saying that you can see the universal within this type of particular. Art helps to bring in the focus of the cumulative experience so that a character well represented with, something like, aren't we all like that? Haven't we all felt that way? Some of the most important characters and fixated characters that we see, they relate to us, and they relate to many people as well, because it's going into that category of the universal, because we're just seeing it out of their particular experience here. So then the genius of good art helps to see the universals through the particular. I guess a good example here would be to use something that I was just watching. Um, it was a clip of Larry David talking about how universal the idea and the worries, the anxieties of traveling for a trip for a couple days, and how we all become very similar with dealing with something like airport security, or how we're all worried about how many pairs of pants we're gonna take with us, and am I packing too much, am I packing too little. These sorts of worries that we all go through when we go through the traveling experience, if you will. And you're taking something that's somewhat mundane, and that's one of the things that makes Seinfeld and Larry David so admired and considered a genius, is you pick something out that's so mundane, but yet everyone has feelings about it, whether it's a cultural norm, or just certain awkward situations, if you will. We all have experienced it, and we all have a sort of opinion about it, and let's make a comedy out of it. And so that's an example, for Aristotle would say, of good art, because we're able to tap into the universals here through a particular person or character or situation. Aristotle, in fact, finds poetry to be more scientific than history. Now, of course, this is a loaded statement in 2025. Of course, we don't think this way, but for Aristotle, and if you actually really do look at the historical works, you can see where he's coming from here, where history really was about sharing narratives, of sharing stories. The history of the Peloponnesian War is, of course, filled with myth. There are, of course, historical accounts and the personal experience of Hesiod, but, it's also filled with flair, if you will, of literacy flair. And so these can't really be trusted for Aristotle, and it can't be scientific, because science is worried about universal theoreticals, and poetry is much more in line with universals of caring for universal principles. It's not just particulars chronologically put together. They're, thoughts about the universals, and so they're much more in line with how he saw science, with talking about theoretical principles. The same could be said about poetry and the arts. Now, with art criticism, and the criteria for art criticism functions with this in mind, having to do with the effect of the emotional representation on a given audience. When it comes to, dramas and plays, tragedy plays, of course, at the time were very popular. He talks of the appropriate characteristics of a good drama, the emotional impact that it could have on an audience. A good tragedy, for example, produces a sort of catharsis of particular emotions, of something like fear and pity. This, of course, could be out of balance, though. and could discourage us or take away our courage. A good tragedy, of course, has fear and pity, and those emotions are released in the outcome. And our emotional state, our palate, if you will, is cleansed. And once we have that good cry once we have a good cry about Leonardo DiCaprio sinking, we'll have a better palate. We'll let the emotional catharsis that could be driving other factors in our lives. Perhaps we're thinking about other things, in this universal depiction of a drama and tragic love story here, where we think about our own particular emotional avenues and how that felt for us. That's good art, for Aristotle. And now you can see why in political theory and arts, just like with his predecessor Plato, if you understand his underlying metaphysic of teleology, it produces the same results as the wheel we talked about with Plato, where each implication about his metaphysics or his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, the divided line, will have implication for education, will have implication for politics, for our state theory. And this could be said about Aristotle. He's talking about the ends, the potentials, and a world of wonder, and letting that play out, and caring about that journey really in his ethics of self-discovery, really, in this world, in this life, though, through our particular experiences. And again, just to reiterate, because of course I remember when I first really took Aristotle more seriously, I somewhat misinterpreted, at least early on, how Aristotle really came off more as practical, certainly perhaps in comparison to his teacher, who talks about transcendent forms. And you could perhaps see on a surface level analysis of Aristotle that he could come off as somewhat more relativistic, with the idea of, as long as you find the middle of the extremes, then have at it. And that's not the case. I do want to reiterate that. He doesn't tell you steadfast what, of course, good ethics are, good situations, if you will, because of course that's perhaps another video on ethics, and what they really should offer up as a solution, instead of something so steadfast, which I don't think is really possible, but that's again for another video. He very much is concerned with the golden mean, though, and I guess, to use Christian terminology, it's to use the gifts that are given to you, the light that's within you, that gives you the input to make the right decisions. And I think Aristotle, in that sense, perhaps is somewhat brushing up with that idea when he talks about following a path towards the supreme being, the golden means, in a world and universe of wonder. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video on talking about Aristotle's ethics. And with that, I think that really concludes Aristotle, at least for now, on the channel. And I hope you guys enjoyed this series of videos on Aristotle as we move along towards, we then will turn to Epicurean thought on the channel. And so I hope you guys will join me for that one as well.